Hello, you're watching Base Shade Highlight, a simple guide to painting miniatures. In this video, I'll be discussing how I prime my models before painting them. I commonly mention they're primed black with a white Zenithal highlight. I don't feel the need to cover this process at the start of all of my videos, but I do get questions about how it's done. I'll be using an airbrush, but if you don't have one, don't worry. This effect can also be accomplished with regular cans of spray paint. Stick around until the end to find out more. Let's get right to it and find out what it means. The first part is simple. Just paint the entire thing a dark color. I'm using black, and this will make up the shadows when we're done. I'm airbrushing at 20 to 25 psi. The dial says that's about 1.5 bar, if you're so inclined. The main reason for priming is to help the paint stick better to the model's surface. Zenithal priming gets its name from the sun's zenith, or when it's directly overhead at its highest point. Basically, we are highlighting the model from directly above. For the second step, I switch to a gray primer and apply it from overhead at roughly a 45-degree angle. I'm holding the airbrush slightly out of the shot, so I've added this helpful tracking arrow. By keeping the angle of attack high, it only allows paint to reach places where an overhead light would hit, and leaves shadows underneath. Stynylrez is my go-to primer, although the name is a bit of a mouthful. For those wondering, it gets its name from these three target materials. Just like when painting, it's important to only apply a little at a time. I do 2 or 3 passes of each color. White is the third and final step of the prime. Be sure to allow time for the previous coat to dry. Even though this primer can be used without thinner, I find the tip does dry out occasionally. This airbrush medium also includes a flow improver to help alleviate that problem. In an effort to help prevent wasted material, I work in small batches with this stuff. I never fill my paint cup more than a quarter of the way. I keep my airbrush overhead and spray at a much tighter angle than in the previous step. I'd say don't go more than 10 or 15 degrees past center. I move my airbrush in to hit lower parts while keeping it angled high. This ensures all upward facing surfaces receive a similar amount of highlighting. Unlike light, paint disperses rapidly the further you get from the source. Because our eyes are naturally drawn to the face, I cheat and highlight it at a lower angle than I should. This removes some of the shadows on Magneto's face and helps it become a focal point. That's it. These models are fully primed and ready to be painted. Here's an uncut clip of me base coating Beast to show how well that undercoat comes through. This blue Model Air paint is relatively thin, which is important for the effect to work. Even after applying the paint, the shadows are still darker and the highlights are still brighter. Now let's take a look at painting Magneto. He has 2 colors that are large enough for me to utilize my airbrush for a base coat. I'll start with red, which is notorious for being a see-through paint color. As you might expect, the shading comes through wonderfully. But now let's move on to purple, which is a much denser, more opaque color. I've masked the body to avoid spraying over the area that I just painted. Even as I'm applying it, you can see there's much less tonal variation in the purple. Here's a closer look at the first model, which was comparatively the easier of the two because it was just one color. From here, I'll use a regular brush to paint the non-blue parts. I may wash a few of the deeper recesses to enhance the shading, and then do some highlighting. Overall, I've got a good start on this model with very little time invested. Magneto is also off to a good start. The red parts are shaded well, but the purple parts, not so much. I'd consider the red parts to be based and shaded in my process, but the purple cape is really just a base coat. It was definitely faster and smoother to apply that base coat with an airbrush, but the Zenithal highlight didn't come through at all. Not only is purple more opaque than other colors, this particular bottle is a high density pigment which may have also contributed to that. You might ask, since the cape didn't highlight nearly as well as the other two colors, why bother with the Zenithal Prime? There are a few reasons to still do it. For one, it was faster and easier just to hit the whole model while priming because I was already doing it for the red parts. 2, now I have these pictures and video that provide me with a good value sketch of what the cape should look like when it's highlighted properly. I'll use them as a reference when I'm painting. From here, there are a lot of places that are too small for an airbrush to paint, so I'll paint them with my regular brush. Now, when it comes to Zenithal priming, you have a number of options. Here, I chose to do a 3-step color prime with black, gray, and white, but you could omit the gray and just do a black and white prime. I've used this method a number of times. I'm not convinced the gray intermediate step is worth the time, but I'm keeping an open mind. If you don't want your shadows to be as dark, you could start with gray and highlight with white. This would be a good option for something like contrast paints and possibly speed paints. They generally don't show up as well over black primer. After you've got an initial coat of primer down, you're not limited to just using primer. I've used this white acrylic ink before, which is very fluid. That makes it much less prone to clogging an airbrush, but that also means that it can run on your model. Here I've got 2 examples that I primed earlier, America Chavez and Miss Marvel. I'm not sure how well it shows up on camera, but I wasn't very careful when applying it and put it on too heavy. The low viscosity caused it to flow and pool in the recesses, which creates a weird recessed highlight, most noticeable in the hair. It's not good, but if you take your time, this can go on even smoother than a primer. Or instead of inks, you can just use regular acrylic paints. I've used this white before, but something I haven't mentioned yet is you aren't limited to just grayscale, black, white, or gray for your prime. You can introduce some color to help influence the paint job of the model. Lastly, for those without an airbrush, rattle can paints are an option instead. They are relatively cheaper and faster, but at the sacrifice of control. A spray can only has 1 speed, full blast. You need to be careful when applying it to avoid drowning your little guys in paint. Quick bursts with a sweeping motion are best. The same techniques I've shown with an airbrush can be used to achieve a Zenithal highlight. Before I had my airbrush, I mostly used generic flat primer like this from a hardware store. If I was batch painting an army, these colored primers from the Army Painter are more expensive, but a big time saver. That's all for this video. If you've enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like and let me know what you thought in the comments down below. I'll be painting these 2 models, plus the others from the Marvel United X-Men box, so subscribe if you'd like to see them completed. Thanks for watching.